Hi, I'm Mike, a lawyer with Cashion Legal. We're an employment law firm based in Calgary, Alberta. If you've recently been let go from your employment and you're wondering whether or not you've been wrongfully dismissed or whether you've been offered a fair severance package, in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the basic components of wrongful dismissal in Alberta so that you're better informed about the situation. And by the end of this video, you're going to have a better understanding of how the law treats these situations. One of the first questions we frequently get about termination of employment is whether or not I've been wrongfully dismissed. In order to understand that question, it's important to understand what wrongful dismissal is. Wrongful dismissal is not anything that's necessarily related to the reasons for termination of your employment or the surrounding circumstances of the termination of your employment. Most often, wrongful dismissal refers to any situation where your employment has been terminated without cause, but you haven't been provided sufficient notice or sufficient pay in lieu of notice, or what we commonly refer to as severance. When assessing whether or not you've been wrongfully dismissed, it's important to know whether or not you've been terminated for cause. If your employment is terminated for cause, that means the employer has identified some act of misconduct that they say is sufficient such that they do not need to provide you with notice or pay in lieu of notice. If your employment is terminated for cause, you're not entitled to any severance. If your employment has been terminated without cause, your employer has an obligation to provide you with notice of termination. What that technically means is that the employer is required to tell you ahead of time that your employment will be terminated at a later date. In practice, employers rarely provide advance notice of termination and instead provide pay in lieu of notice. Understanding the obligation to provide notice is important to assessing whether or not you've been wrongfully dismissed, because whether or not you've been wrongfully dismissed will depend on whether the employer provided adequate notice or pay in lieu of notice. If you have been wrongfully dismissed, meaning that your employment has been terminated without sufficient notice or pay in lieu of notice, the primary question to ask is how much notice are you entitled to? In Alberta, there are various sources of the entitlement to notice. We have a video on our website dealing with severance packages where we go through that in more detail. If you want to know more about your entitlement to severance, I recommend that you watch that video. One common misconception is that the employer needs to provide a reason for terminating your employment. In reality, if the employer is providing you with sufficient notice or with sufficient pay in lieu of notice, they don't actually need to provide you with a reason for termination, and that reason doesn't need to be one that you agree with in the first place. The fact is that employers have a very broad right to terminate without cause. Just because you disagree with the employer's decision does not mean that you have been wrongfully dismissed. If after watching this video, you're still wondering whether or not you were wrongfully terminated, or if you have more questions about your severance package, do not hesitate to contact us today to book a consultation.